Hello everyone and welcome to episode 58 of the Layton Fitness podcast. Now in today's episode we're going to be discussing the low bar squat. Now you probably realise the last couple of episodes I've discussed the deadlift in terms of the technique and also the bench press in terms of the technique as well, so I thought it would be a useful idea to cover the other key lift, the squat. Now in today's episode we're specifically discussing the low bar squat, and you may or may not have heard of this squat before. You may be thinking, what's the difference between the low bar squat and the traditional high bar squat? Now the main key difference is just the bar position. Instead of the bar being rested on the mid trap for the high bar squat, the low bar squat is basically resting on top of the rear delt, and this is probably only 1 or 2 inches difference in terms of bar positioning, but it dramatically changes the biomechanics of the lift, and as a result typically most people are stronger performing the low bar squat. Now the main reason for this is just there's more posterior chain activation, so there's more glutes, hamstrings, lower back, hips being involved, and as a result most people typically can move higher loads. Now as a result this is very enticing for strength trainees, those looking to build more muscle mass, those looking to get exceptionally strong within the squat, i.e. a powerlifter. I probably wouldn't suggest this for a traditional athlete, so someone performing other sports. I would actually stick with the high bar squat. Now the main reason being there's more carryover with the high bar squat to things like jumping, etc. So if you're someone who performs a sport, I'd actually stick with the high bar squat. Whereas with other individuals, I'd certainly suggest giving the low bar squat a go. It's not to say that it's better or worse compared to the high bar squat, but give both a try. You'll find extremely strong bodybuilders, powerlifting still performing the high bar squat. However, there is certainly a shift towards more people using the low bar squat, and like I mentioned, most people are typically strong with the low bar squat, and as a result this will potentially allow you to use more volume as well. And as I've discussed on some other podcasts, volume is the biggest primary determining factor for influencing hypertrophy. So let's really dive deep into the technique. There's going to be a little bit of carryover in terms of some of the cues I talk about with the deadlift as well, which will be interesting because if you can remember this cue for one lift, there's no reason why you can't apply it for the other lift as well. So firstly, bar position. Briefly touching it, essentially that bar is going to be resting on top of the rear delt. So what I want to do now is while you're sitting down is focus on actually pulling your elbows back behind you. Focus on trying to squeeze your shoulder blades together and try and pull your elbows up, but at the same time pull them back behind you. You'll notice that your rear delt should pop out your back essentially. So therefore I want you to focus on feeling that rear delt, and you can probably see how if you have that bar positioned on top of that rear delt, it almost creates a mini shelf, and this is exactly where we want that bar position for the low bar squat. Second thing I want you to think about is likewise the deadlift. Focus on bracing that core correctly. Now bracing the core correctly basically means pushing your abdominal wall out, taking a big deep breath prior to that and holding that position for the whole repetition. So what I want you to imagine is if someone were to punch you in the stomach, what would be the feeling you'd make? You'd basically brace your abdominal wall, you'd really focus on pushing those abs out, and that's the feeling you want to have for your squat. So focus on a big deep breath, holding that brace position for the whole lift, and then breathing out only when you've completed a full repetition. Now with regards to feet position, this is going to be largely personal preference and also subject to limb length, so you have to play around this, but for most individuals it's typically around shoulder width apart, maybe slightly wider than this, and you're going to focus on pointing your toes outwards slightly, so about 45 degrees. You'd be surprised how many people I see performing the squat incorrectly, and one of the biggest problems of this is the setup, i.e. their toes are just pointing straight towards the wall rather than actually turning them out. And the reason why this is critical, this will allow you to drive your knees out, and this will help prevent that buckling. Like you've probably seen someone squat before and their knees buckle inwards on the way up from the squat. So by having those toes pointed out and consciously focusing on driving those knees out for the lowering and also coming out of the hole at the bottom of the squat as well, that's going to help you massively. Now in terms of the actual technique of the actual lift, with the low bar squat I want you to focus more on sitting back down behind you. Now with the high bar squat, traditionally we're actually focusing on breaking from the knees first, i.e. the knees track out forward slightly. Contrary to popular belief, the knees for the high bar squat do actually go forward slightly, and then you focus on driving the knees out, and then the individual pretty much sits straight down in an up and down motion. Whereas the high bar squat, we're focusing on simultaneously dropping the hips back while simultaneously driving the knees out. So hips come back, knees are driven out, and therefore you're going to notice that as you lower yourself down, the torso is going to be slightly more leant forward in comparison to the high bar. So the high bar really focusing on that up and down motion, whereas low bar, torso is a little bit closer to parallel to the floor, and you're focusing on dropping them hips back, driving the knees out. Now once you're at that bottom position, ideally we want to get to parallel or below parallel to the floor, so i.e. in terms of your quad position, we want to get that just below parallel to the floor. And then from the bottom position, this is the key, really focusing on again pushing our midfoot through the floor, likewise with the deadlift. However, in terms of coming out of the squat, rather than with the high bar squat where we're just focusing on going straight up and straight down, the low bar squat really focus on trying to drive your lower back towards the ceiling. Now I say this with the caveat you keep a neutral spine, so this isn't a traditional what's called a butt wink where the hips shoot up too quickly. We're focusing on driving that lower back towards the ceiling but the back stays straight. Imagine if someone had their hand on your lower back at the bottom of the squat, you're focusing on trying to push their hand away, drive that lower back towards the ceiling, but at the same time keep that neutral spine, and therefore you won't get that traditional butt wink look. So that's the form, and that is the difference between that and the high bar squat. I probably will discuss the high bar squat potentially next week or relatively soon, just so you can see the differences between the two. Now, with regards to potentially wearing a belt or squat shoes, that actually, for most individuals, I'd actually suggest both. Unless you're an absolute beginner, I think it's useful to train your core effectively, but once you're past the beginner phase, a belt can be useful to allow you to increase intra-abdominal pressure. So as such, this will allow you to brace against something when you're bracing your core. So as I mentioned throughout the podcast when I was talking about pushing your stomach out, but having a belt there, that really makes it so much easier because you've got something to push up against, and as a result you find you'll be much tighter, you can keep more of a neutral spine, and also this can help protect your lower back to a degree. Additionally, with the squat shoes, really strongly recommend looking at these as well. It essentially has a raised solid heel, and therefore that allows you to get lower, you can get better depth, but also because there's no air trapped in the sole, likewise with a running shoe, it doesn't compress, and as a result it's a more stable shoe, be stronger, more explosive, and actually makes a big difference. You wouldn't think a shoe would make that much difference, but it really actually does make a significant difference. So hopefully you found this useful. Hopefully you can potentially give this a try. I'd suggest trying it for a few weeks just because it does take a little bit of time to get used to. If you're still yet to download my free ebook, How to Set Up a Nutrition Plan, if you go to James Layton, Layton Fitness.co.uk, you can see the tab at the top of the page and download that immediately. Additionally, you'll see all my other podcast episodes on the website as well as on iTunes. You can see all of my other blog articles, videos. I've got over 100 videos on the site. And you can also learn more about myself and some of the products and services I have available. Feel free to subscribe on iTunes and leave a review if you've enjoyed the podcast. Thank you very much. I'll speak to you soon. Take care.